Welcome to this reading of historian Mark Fee's book, The Republic of Nature, from the University of Washington Press, published in 2012. This is the section titled By the Law of Nature and of Nature's God, the Philosophy of Declaring American Independence. Thomas Jefferson believed in an orderly universe. So important was the universe's order to Jefferson that he thought it should serve as the basis of society. Through the exercise of the reason and the senses, natural capacities of the mind and body, people should determine the nature of heaven, earth, and humanity too, and they should arrange their institutions accordingly. Above all, people should construct the form of government that was most reasonable, because it most respected the true nature of mankind, that of reasoning human beings. Jefferson invoked nature's timeless truths, its natural laws, in all parts of his life, from the house in which he lived to the epochal event to which his name became forever linked, the American Revolution. The ideas, universal laws evident in the nature of mankind, were at once Newtonian and Lockean. These are some philosophers of the European Enlightenment. Newton did some math stuff. Maybe did something about an apple and calculus. Keep reading to learn about John Locke. Like the light of reason that shone from the mountaintop, they radiated outward these ideas, a beacon to the world. Jefferson wrote these ideas into the Declaration of Independence, of which an excerpt appears below. Here is the American Declaration of Independence. Part of it, at least. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve or disappear the political bands or connections which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So basically, why are the colonists declaring independence from Britain? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable, or cannot be taken away, rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to organize new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Really key ideas about the philosophy of the American Revolution here in this document. The Declaration of Independence marked a shift in ideas about nature and was integral to the history of the Revolution. No longer would people such as Jefferson take received wisdom, especially revealed religion, as an article of faith. Instead, they would use their God-given, natural human capacities, reason, and the senses, to discover, through experience, empirical observation, and scientific experiment, the natural laws of man and the physical matter of which he was made. Their discoveries told them that men were born with an inherent right to their thoughts, their bodies, and the things their bodies produced, their property. To protect their natural rights, including their right to property, they formed governments. If a government should violate their natural rights by controlling their lives or taking their property without their consent, then they could exercise their natural right to form a new government. The revolutionary ideas of Jefferson and his compatriots were not mere fancy. They offered a compelling description of reality, and they were, and have been ever since, extremely attractive to people the world over. As important as those ideas of nature were, they alone did not determine the course of the American Revolution, because the New World environment enabled and limited the ability of Jefferson and others to think and act. Demographic changes, an abundance of land relative to population size, climate, soils, and geographical isolation from Europe, among other factors, fostered distinctive colonial cultures and political systems, and created the circumstances for an independent American republic. Those environmental conditions, however, did not always favor the revolution. Some contributed to social, economic, and political conflicts that threatened to destroy the new nation. Although Jefferson recognized a clockwork Newtonian universe, he had to acknowledge the volatility and messiness of lived experience. "I hold it," he famously told James Madison in 1787, "that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. Reconciling fixed truths with a world in flux was not easy, as Jefferson and other revolutionaries learned." Try as they might, the colonists did not recreate exactly the patterns of land use and ownership they had known in the British Isles. Clover, wheat, hogs, dairy cattle, and fences overspread their fields and pastures, but so did corn, beans, and pumpkins, plants acquired from Indians. Like the Indians, settlers in the backcountry cultivated a piece of ground until it lost its fertility, and then cleared a new plot, while shrubs and trees grew back on the old. Most important, land ownership in the Americas was more widespread than in Britain and the rest of Europe. The deaths and removal of Indians, along with the sheer size of the New World, meant that many male colonists got the soil they had come for. In combination with the simple physical distance of the colonies from the parent country, population growth, geographical mobility, and an abundance of land undermined social hierarchy and enabled the formation of distinctive republican governments in the colonies. By the 18th century, 2/3 of white colonists owned land, in contrast to 1/5 of the English population back in England. More land and land ownership conferred economic independence, weakened the bonds of dependency and the habits of deference that typified monarchical society, that is, societies ruled by kings, and they broadened political participation. New England landowners, called freeholders, participated in town governments that sent representatives to colonial assemblies. In the Chesapeake region, around Virginia, property holders elected representatives to colonial legislatures. The institutions were hardly model democracies, as not everyone can vote, but they revealed the extent to which land and material wealth enfranchised or gave power to, or the right to vote, colonists. Those assemblies also jealously guarded important prerogatives: the right to initiate legislation and to levy taxes, that is, to make laws and force taxes. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, that's the 1600s and the 1800s, the assemblies repeatedly resisted the efforts of Britain to weaken their power, especially their power to control the purse, to tax. Ultimately, the imperial system was simply too weak, and the colonial political system too strong, and too geographically distant from Britain, for governors, parliament, and king to dominate. "The laws of England are bounded within the 4 seas, and does not reach America," the Massachusetts legislature declared in 1678, a telling statement that Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson would echo. In the process of establishing themselves in a new land and forming new governments, the colonists fashioned what was perhaps their most important characteristic, a unique identity. Puritans likened the dangerous Atlantic voyage to a new birth, a literal rite of passage, as the historian Alan Taylor put it, that bonded them and proved that God looked on them with favor. When at last the Plymouth colonists made landfall, wrote William Bradford, they, quote, "fell on their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the fast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element." From such travails or trials, the colonists became New Englanders, Virginians, or Carolinians. They're not English anymore. They have a new identity. During the 1700s, colonial identity moderated and then sharpened. In the middle of the century, the colonists' growing population and wealth and the intensification of trade with the mother country made them feel closer to Britain. The confidence they derived from that feeling, however, encouraged them to see themselves as the equals of anyone else in the empire, and to insist on their rights as Englishmen. Eventually, out of the circumstances, at once local and imperial, the colonists imagined themselves to be distinctly American. To be American was to have land, wealth, and liberty like no one else in the empire. To be American was to defend that land, wealth, and liberty by joining together in an independent federation. Quote, "I am not a Virginian," the orator and political firebrand Patrick Henry declaimed in 1774, "but an American." What finally drove the colonists to independence was not simply that they had become different people. The New World changed the empire, too, in ways that made its leaders unable to see the growing distinctions between them and the colonies they purported to rule. This final estrangement followed the 7 Years' War, also called, in its North American manifestation, the French and Indian War, which began in 1754, but which officially lasted from 1756 to 1763. The colonists' desire for land in the Ohio Valley, the region west of the Appalachian Mountains, drained by the Ohio River, helped bring on the conflict. Britain, France, and the Indian allies of each fought over control of the area, and the contest escalated into a struggle for predominance in North America as a whole. Britain won, and so gained Ohio as well as Quebec and other Canadian lands. But this stunning victory augured poorly for the empire. Augured means like forecasted or predicted. The Romans used to cut open the entrails of birds to figure out what was going to happen in the future. That's how they augured. Anyway, but this stunning victory augured poorly for the empire. So they win this big victory, it's not going to go well for them. Exhausted by fighting and bloated by its territorial conquests, Britain needed revenue to pay its enormous war debt and to administer its North American territory. They just got a whole bunch more land. How it attempted to raise that huge sum and govern that vast natural expanse alienated its American subjects. Several times Britain sought to tax the colonists. George III, his ministers, and a majority in Parliament thought it sensible to levy, which means thought it sensible to levy special duties or taxes on the Americans. Since the mid-1600s, the purpose of the empire had been to extract the colony's natural wealth for the benefit of the parent country. Furs, hides, wool, tobacco, indigo, sugar, pine lumber, and other products were supposed to yield profits for colonists, and in turn, revenue for the treasury of Britain. To require the colonists to help pay for the war continued a long-standing policy. That the victory had protected and secured the colonists' place in North America was one more excellent reason why the colonists should contribute their fair share. That some American entrepreneurs and businessmen had profited handsomely from the parent country's wartime military expenditures only solidified the Crown's argument that the colonists should pay for the blessings of empire. But the distant offspring in the colonies rejected this imperial logic. No, the colonists concluded, they would not accept taxation imposed from afar. They never had submitted to such authority in the first place. Parliament at times had requisitioned several special funds from colonial legislatures, but had never imposed an outright tax. During the 7 Years' War, the colonists and their assemblies had resisted British efforts to squeeze revenue from them. Needing their cooperation to win the war, imperial officials from Britain had backed off and instead treated the colonies as not as subjects, but as allies. Rather than requiring them to pay, the British government had asked them for help and reimbursed them for the expense of mobilizing provincial militias. By 1765, the Assembly's power over taxation had evolved into an immutable right. For Britain to violate it now, many colonists believe, would be a monstrous usurpation or a stealing of power. Struggle ensued. British officials responded gently, trying one tax after another, sugar, tea, stamps, and more, to coax revenue from America. At each turn, the colonists dug in their heels. Frustration finally turned to anger as king, ministers, and parliament vowed to make the colonies pay. But Britain's leaders could not see how their own actions contributed to the problem. As the historian Fred Anderson wrote, the British did not understand that their efforts had begun to precipitate opposition. Precipitate meaning create opposition out of Americans' inchoate, provincial disinclination to be governed from a distance, and their widely held belief that taxes could not be levied without consent. To many colonists, the policies intended to govern Western lands were as objectionable as the taxes. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 sought to regulate relations between Britons and Indians in the Ohio Valley. Indians were subjects too, and to keep colonists away from them and their land and prevent yet another costly war, George III prohibited British settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, from the Great Lakes to Florida. A later elaboration of this policy, the Quebec Act of 1774, safeguarded French law and the Catholic religion among Canadian subjects in the Ohio Valley. Such measures frustrated and angered colonists. Speculators and settlers had developed a powerful hunger for land on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. How could the king shut them out? How could he protect Indians while denying the needs of the colonists? How could he put the interests of the Catholic subjects ahead of Protestant interests? It was wrong, they said. Nothing should block them from that most cherished of rights, the pursuit of land and wealth. Taxation and restrictions on settlement weakened rather than strengthened Britain's hold on North America. Rather than bind the colonies to the parent, imperial policies hastened the offspring's alienation. One of the final blows came in 1775, when British forces took up arms against the colonists at Concord, Massachusetts, and eventually Lexington as well. Younger colonists with little or no memory of past insults were especially shocked and outraged. By 1776, Americans of all kinds felt like strangers to the nation that had spawned them. On the periphery of British civilization, on the far frontier of the Anglo world, they sensed the gulf. Paine and Jefferson were right. Distance was the natural basis on which the New World outgrew the old. A government of our own is our natural right. Europeans had moved over the earth, and in an environment different from where they have left, built a new society. Accompanying this social migration was an intellectual migration, on which the colonists imported European notions of natural law and natural rights. But much as society changed under New World conditions, so did ideas. Americans eventually invoked nature, not to revive what they saw as the proper relationship between kings and subjects, but to create a wholly new political arrangement, a new nation. A radical alteration in the order of things needed an equally radical justification. But no source but nature, or nature, as 18th century people sometimes put it, capitalized as opposed to lowercase, would suffice. The use of nature to justify liberty then rippled through the country, as people seized on this powerful philosophical tool and modified it to serve their own ends. When African Americans began to claim their natural right to freedom, the revolution had truly arrived. Natural law and natural rights had a long history before the colonists brought them to America. The geography of ideas along which they traveled stretched back through the medieval and early Christian period and into antiquity, that is, the classical world of Greece and Rome. For centuries, thinkers pointed to a fundamental, eternal principle, a higher law inherent in humans and the world that set forth a universal standard of justice. According to this natural law, all people, by virtue of their humanity, or by virtue as their status as children of God, had natural rights, without which they could not maintain a basic level of dignity. Although divided by race, rank, wealth, or talent, all humans were equal before the law. At times, the concept of natural law lay dormant, asleep, existing only as a latent potential in the dusty pages of forgotten scrolls. But readers rediscovered it again and again, called it back to life, and restated it in terms relevant to their own times. In the 1600s and 1700s, Europeans refashioned natural law to meet the needs of the age. In part, economic changes prompted the revision. In Britain, the intensification of commerce, aka trade, boosted food supplies, uprooted people, and shifted economic activity from the growing of crops and livestock for local communities to the production and exchange of surpluses for international markets, or imperial international markets. Observers, forerunners of modern economists, wondered what motivated the merchants and tradesmen who profited from the new system, which seemed to function with law-like regularity. These proto-economists suggested that a universal, self-interested human nature impelled individual economic actors. All men by nature are the same, wrote Hosea Child in 1690. Trade is in its nature free, stated Charles Devant in 1695, and finds its own channel and best directs its course. The beginnings of the ideas of free trade in classical economics. Modern economic notions of human nature and natural law derived from and reinforced the scientific revolution, which emphasized nature as the source of knowledge and truth. Through the observation of physical phenomenon and the application of reason, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Leeuwenhoek, Newton, and other natural philosophers, aka scientists, discovered order in the universe. Peering down through their microscopes, gazing up through their telescopes, or just looking at the world around them, they observed the predictable, mechanistic movement of matter, cells divided, planets orbited, and, as Newton famously discerned, gravity pulled apples down to earth. Nature seemed to have a design, which must, the scientists concluded, be the work of God. Humans were God's creation too, and other thinkers, economists and political philosophers, saw a correspondence between the laws of physical nature and the laws of human nature. Through the use of reason, a God-given natural capacity, people could behave and organize their governments properly. When they acted according to reason, people acted naturally, according to natural law. Europeans placed special value on natural law and the rights it conferred because those principles justified their resistance to the growing power of monarchs, kings, and centralized government. During the 17th and 18th centuries, that is the 1600s and 1700s, European kings amassed extraordinary military and political might as they strove to unify their nations and govern them more efficiently. Not everyone was happy with the state of affairs. In Britain, landowners, shopkeepers, and merchants, many of them religious Puritans, struggled against the Stuart monarchs' efforts to raise taxes, circumvent Parliament, and reestablish that horrible thing that is the Catholic Church, at least from these Puritan perspectives. Twice British subjects deposed their rulers, even going so far as to behead one of them, Charles, who, I guess Charles is also the king now, but he's a different Charles. Such disloyalty angered the kings and their supporters, who contended that authority naturally flowed down through the crown. But many Britons disagreed. In their view, authority naturally originated with the people and served to check the monarch's aggressive tendencies. Natural law, they said, gave them the right to counter royal arrogance. By the 1700s, a fully developed theory of natural law that served the needs of the American revolutionaries had evolved. It had no single author, but the English philosopher John Locke was the most responsible for elaborating it. Locke was a Puritan who had lived through the political tumult or chaos of the 1600s, and late in the century he set down his thoughts on the nature of government. From the individual person to society as a whole, natural law shaped the human condition. All people were born free and equal, in the sense that no one was born above anyone else, and no one should harm the life, health, liberty, or property of another. He says this is true across all societies, at least at first. By exercising reason, people would discover this universal truth, and they would build a society and a government based on it. A crucial stage in the formation of social life was the creation of property. Each person owned his body and the labor it could perform. By cutting trees, plowing soil, hunting animals, or mining gold, a person, in effect, joined his labor to nature, and so made that modified nature his property. This is how Locke put it. Quote, "Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property." Because people needed to be secure in their individual persons and property, they left the state of nature and came together as a society to establish a compact, an agreement, by which they voluntarily turned over to the government the power to protect their rights. But if any government or leader violated those rights by acting unnaturally and threatening persons and property, if, for example, a tyrant took the people's property or taxed them without their consent, their leave, then a change was in order. Under such circumstances, the people, as Locke said, have a right to resume their original liberty, and, by the establishment of a new legislative government, provide for their own safety and security, which is to the end for which they are in society. The Lockean theory of natural law and natural rights appealed to 18th century American colonists. They had come to a part of the world that was in a state of nature, they believed. There was no government before them, they think, and by their labor transformed the land into farms, towns, and property. Locke, in fact, had pointed to them as the case study of how humanity created property and built society from the earth's raw materials. Quote, "Thus in the beginning, all the world was America," he had written. That is an empty land that people will create society in. Is that true? Well, it wasn't empty before those diseases showed up. In the process, the colonists had formed colonial legislatures that protected their interests. But the king, his ministers, and parliament had imposed taxes and restricted westward migration, which threatened the colonists' persons and property. Now it was up to the Americans to establish a new legislative government, as Locke would have said, and resume their original liberty, aka get rid of Parliament and the king. Here's what historians Johnson and Johnson, so taking a break from this reading, this is another little excerpt, how they describe Locke's ideas in their textbook, The Human Drama, which was published in 2014. The Englishman John Locke was one of the most influential political thinkers of the European Enlightenment. He was an empiricist, which meant that he looked at the natural world and at actual people in order to develop his insights. He's not getting it from, for instance, the church. Locke is perhaps best remembered for his idea of a social contract, where political leaders achieve legitimacy, aka the right to rule, by responding to the will of the people. In his Treatise of Government, Locke stated that there is an implicit contract between the governed and the governors. If the government violates that contract, the people have the right to overthrow the government. We can see this in the Declaration of Independence, by the way. Although the Chinese philosopher Mencius had reached a similar conclusion many centuries earlier, great burn against these silly Europeans with their social contract theories, Locke's social contract was a radical idea in the age of strong kings, and it was a tremendous threat to their absolute power. It proved to be an important step in the development of democratic governments, and profoundly influenced both the American and French revolutions in the late 1700s. Many words in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence are taken directly from Locke's Treaty on Government, as we'll see. The concept of natural law traveled through the colonies along several routes. Some people actually read the works of Locke and other political philosophers. A number of books by these scholars appeared on reading lists at Harvard and other colleges. Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui, a professor of natural and civil law at the University of Geneva, authored The Principles of Natural and Politic Law, the English translation of which became a standard textbook at American universities. Natural law, Burlamaqui wrote, quote, is that which so necessarily agrees with the nature and state of man, that without observing its maxims or truths, the peace and happiness of society can never be preserved. As this law has an essential agreeableness with the constitution of human nature, the knowledge thereof may be attained merely by the light of reason, and hence it is called natural. You don't need anyone to tell you, you can figure it out just using your own reason. Lockean thought also moved among less elite routes. In Philadelphia, the Junto, or the Club of the Leather Aprons, served as a forum on which working men discussed political and economic ideas, and it eventually evolved into a reading society. Of the first 375 books the Junto members collected, the foundation of North America's first library, more had come from the pen of John Locke than any other author, the historian Gary Nash has written. Locke and other philosophers were not easy to read, to be sure, as evidenced by my reading of this very thing. As the historian Carl Becker concluded, Locke's theory was a, quote, dreary devil of an argument, staggering from assumption posited as premise to conclusion implicit in the assumption. It's gobbledygook. Most people, therefore, learned about natural law indirectly. They listened to sermons at church, maybe in the Great Awakening. They read newspapers and pamphlets, and they talked to one another. By such formal and informal means, natural law and natural rights came to pervade the thought and rhetoric of a movement that culminated in the American Revolution. Throughout the colonies, people began to speak and write of natural law, the first law of nature, natural rights, and the rights of human nature, and how neither the king's dictates, just his orders, nor parliamentary laws could overrule them. James Otis, in The Rights of the British Colonists Asserted and Proved, a pamphlet published in 1764, said so. There can be no prescription old enough, he stated, to supersede the law of nature and the grant of God Almighty, who has given to all men a natural right to be free, and they have it ordinarily in their power to make themselves so, if they please. Similar assertions continued up to the Revolution and beyond. Quote, what are all the riches, the luxuries, and even the conveniences of life compared with that liberty wherewith God and nature have set us free? Asks the artisan, which is a person who creates goods, manufactured goods, Alexander McDougall in 1770 in an open letter to the people of New York. Quote, among the natural rights of the colonists, wrote Samuel Adams in 1774, are these. First, a right to life. Secondly, to liberty. Thirdly, to property, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. If the colonists had natural rights, then surely a king who disregarded those rights was a, quote, unnatural parent. As the satirist, I guess, and playwright Mercy Otis Warren explained to an acquaintance in 1774. That year, Thomas Jefferson, wrote a summary of the view of the rights to British America, in which he claimed that the colonists, quote, possessed a right which nature has given to all men, to migrate to new lands and there establish new societies with laws and regulations suited to the changed circumstances. Numerous local and state declarations of independence employed the language of natural law and natural rights. Pennsylvania severed its ties to Britain in 1776, quote, in obedience to the first principles of nature, as the only measure left to us to preserve and establish our liberties and to transmit them inviolate, which means not dirtied, perfectly pure, to posterity, that is, their children and descendants, the future. Perhaps the strongest voice for the colonists' natural rights, and the one that finally pushed the Continental Congress towards the Declaration, was that of Thomas Paine, a corset maker who only recently had immigrated from Britain to America. Paine was among the first to call openly for separation. In Common Sense, published in January 1776, he attacked the monarchy as unnatural and asserted that a government of our own is our own natural right. The time had come for independence, he claimed. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part." What a British way of putting it. When Congress met in Philadelphia in June 1776, it assigned the task of drafting a Declaration of Independence to Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Livingston, and Sherman. The committee asked Adams and Jefferson to write the text. Adams then turned the responsibility over to Jefferson, who retired to his portable writing desk and quickly scratched out a statement containing the philosophical proposition that nature was the source of American liberty. As he later explained, the point was not to advance new ideas, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject, to put forth a document that would be an expression of the American mind. Jefferson then brought the document to the committee, which made a few alterations before presenting it to the entire assembly. More deliberations and revisions ensued. Finally, on July 4th, 1776, in the now famous meeting hall topped by a steeple, that is Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. So this reading is about the ideas behind the Declaration. And here again is that declaration. I'll read it one more time because it's a fun thing. Think about if you can see the ideas behind the words here. The founding document of the United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, aka get rid of Britain, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God, there it is, entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Here are the causes. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not property like John Locke would have put it, but pursuit of happiness. Is that property? Is it not? I don't know. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's this reading. Thanks for listening. Have a great day and a great life.